Okay, welcome back. Last week we spent some time talking about the foundations of government. Why we have a government, how we set up the government that we have, and a basic overview of how the criminal justice system looks within that governmental system. This week we're going to spend some time talking about crime, how it's defined, how it's created, what the elements of a crime are, and what are the consequences of those criminal laws on the lives of individual citizens in the community. One of the big debates in the world of criminal justice has been, what defines a crime? What is a criminal act? If we're going to talk about crime and criminal justice, then this is a pretty important definition to get right. There are certain social definitions that inform us on how we should act and how we should behave and even how we should think. One level of that is social norms. These are the rules of the community in which we live. We're taught these norms through interactions with other individuals in our community, our families, our environment. They're passed down to us from our families and school systems and all the social structures and churches that we have to teach us how to behave and what's expected of you in the society that you live in. And we're expected to live by these norms. Mores are morality rules. These are rules that go deeper than social norms. These inform us about what is right and what's wrong. At the very heart and core of who we are as a human, what should we be doing and what shouldn't we be doing, and why? Again, these are passed down mostly by our parents and our religion and our cultural beliefs and heritage and the experiences we've had throughout our lifetime. Taboos are violations or upsettings of some of these social norms. Not necessarily things that would constitute crime or be always destructive to the society in which we live in, but things that are seen as outside the norm and frowned upon in the community in which we reside. Cultural are rules of behavior based on passed down values. We all have a unique culture, and that cultural background informs us about what's expected of us within those cultural boundaries. How we should act, how we should react in certain situations, how we should think through problems, and basically how we should live our lives. Deviance is any violation of those social norms. Now, deviance isn't always criminal behavior. Sometimes it can be, but sometimes criminal behavior doesn't necessarily have to be deviant. Deviant just means that in some way you violated the social norms of your community. And usually there'll be some type of a punishment or adverse effect presented to you by the community for whatever social norm you violated. Legal definitions are much more straightforward, and they're the definitions we'll stick to mostly in this class. According to legal definitions of crime, a crime is only a criminal act because a legislature somewhere sat in a room and decided that this action, this behavior, is so deplorable, so destructive to the society under which the governing body has power, that it needs to be done away with, and anyone who commits that act needs to be punished. The next question that begs to be answered is, where do laws come from? Why do we create laws, and who decides what laws get to be created? And I mean, we know it's the legislature, but who's in the legislature, and why are they creating the laws that they are? There's three different views we're going to talk about. The first one is the interactionist view. Now, this view says that no real behavior, or not many, are actually deviant within themselves. The people in power have the power to decide what acts are deviant and therefore should be criminal and what acts aren't. And so these individuals will pass laws that reflect their experience and background, but not necessarily everyone's in the community in which they're passing the law for. They'll pass laws that benefit them and their constituencies, even if those laws aren't the best for other members of the community. According to the consensus view, laws are created because people in the community and people in the society come together, agree on what laws should be made, what acts should be deemed illegal and destructive to society, and they pass laws based on those agreeances. The conflict view basically says, we're always in a state of conflict as a society. That's how society moves forward. One group feels like that they're not being represented, and they speak up, and they make their voices heard, and that creates conflict with other, more established groups. As they gain more power and influence, they're able to influence the criminal laws that are created as well to further the agenda of whatever group you're talking about. Those in power have the power to pass laws, and some of those laws are passed to make sure that they stay in power. When people are oppressed too much, they seek to gain power within that system. They make their voices heard, and as they gain power, they're able to influence change. Now, within criminal law, we also have different levels of criminal law, different levels of wrongdoing, as you will. First, we have mala in se crimes. Now, mala in se crimes are crimes that are so deplorable, so evil, so destructive to the very nature of society, that every society in history has passed laws at least regulating that behavior. So, for instance, murder. Some societies would allow murder in certain cases, but they at least regulated it and recognized that in certain circumstances murder is wrong. Same way with crimes such as sexual assault. In almost every civilization we see legal codes that protect individuals from sexual assault. Mala prohibita crimes are crimes that are only illegal and only crimes because the jurisdiction in which you're in has passed that law during this time and space. So in other words, right now, where you're at, that action is illegal. If I'm smoking weed in my state because it's passed legal marijuana laws, and I step over in another state that doesn't, I can be arrested in that other state. Because in that jurisdiction, it's still illegal. So it's only a law because it's a law here now. Now, in order for a crime to be considered just, you have to prove each of these elements of a crime. And this is where a good defense attorney is worth their weight in gold. Because if the prosecution does not prove all the elements of a crime, I can't be punished for breaking that crime. So let's take a closer look at what these elements are. The first one is harm. My action has to cause a harm to someone else. If no harm is done, then there really wasn't a crime that took place. Now, the first thing that might come to your mind is, well, what about seatbelt laws? Who am I hurting if I decide to go this evening, not buckle up, and take a chance on getting a wreck and killing myself? Well, the argument there is the harm could be to society as a whole, as you might not have the money to pay for your medical bills. We're going to lose out on the lost revenue from your taxes you could pay if you lived another 20 years. And so there is some harm related to your behavior, even if it's something that's not immediately recognizable. Next is legality. There has to be a statute in place. A good example of this is a few years ago, there was a question about sexting. It was a new thing young people were doing, and there were no real legal codes against it on the books specifically because it was a new thing and the criminal justice system hadn't had enough time to catch up. Now, the public wanted the criminal justice system to do something because this is a very dangerous practice. It can lead to all kinds of victimization and unwanted consequences. But there was no law that they were specifically breaking by doing this behavior. They tried to apply laws that weren't really meant for that particular action, and what you wound up having was children were being placed on sex offender registries for the rest of their life. And everybody realized it was an overreach of government, but really there was nothing in place besides those laws. Actus reus, there has to be an action. What that means is that you can't prosecute me for thinking about committing a crime. I can think all I want and imagine and fantasize about killing someone, but that's not a crime. A few years ago, there was a police officer who was arrested. He had plans of killing and eating his neighbor. He had looked up cannibalist blogs and websites. I didn't even know such a thing existed until this case came up. And had come up with recipes and how to cook his neighbor. And the police found out about it and they arrested him. He got charged and he was sent to prison. On appeal, here not too long ago, his conviction was overturned because you can't prosecute somebody for fantasizing or wanting to do something. They have to take an action. Now, the first thing that might come to your mind is, well, what about attempted crimes, attempted murder? Well, even in those cases, you have to have some action. Now, the action doesn't have to be the actual commission of the murder, thus the word attempted, but there has to have been some gathering of weapons to use, some surveillance on the victim, figuring out when they're going to be where. There has to be some actionable behavior that you've taken that we can see and present to the court. Mens rea, you have to intend to do the crime you commit. I can't prosecute you if you're out on a hunting expedition and your friend accidentally gets shot and it's really an accident because you didn't intend to kill him. If you go out tonight and you buckle up and you follow all the safety rules, you do everything you're supposed to, and you hit a wet spot and you slide hydroplane into someone and kill someone, I can't charge you with vehicular homicide because you didn't mean to kill anybody. Death. Causation. My behavior has to cause the harm. And related to that is concurrence. The behavior and the intent have to come together in close proximity. Death. And lastly, punishment. This is the easiest to understand in that in order for something to be a criminal act, there has to be a punishment ascribed to it. And if you look at statutes like homicide or theft or whatever it is, they'll have the elements of the crime spelled out 1, 2, 3, 4, and then underneath it, it'll have the punishment ascribed. This is a Class A felony. This is a Class B misdemeanor punishable by. So there has to be some type of punishment ascribed to people who commit that crime. One of the problems with criminal law is sometimes we over-criminalize certain actions. There's an argument that we've over-criminalized the drug problem in America, that the drug war has been a complete and dismal failure, and that we're no better off, and as a matter of fact, worse off than we were when we started this war on drugs in the 1970s. And that maybe social reform, such as more treatment for drug use, would be more effective. Here are some examples of overcriminalization that are just kind of funny, but they also make us think that at some point, a group of people in a legislature got together and said, you know what? Our society is so plagued with these problems, let's come together and pass a law saying we won't tolerate this anymore. In Arizona, it's illegal for a donkey to sleep in a bathtub. In Wichita, Kansas, it's illegal to say rude things on the phone. In Kentucky, it's illegal to dye a duckling blue and sell it unless you dye at least 6 of them. Then it's okay. In Maryland, it's illegal to use profanity on a highway. South Carolina, it's illegal for anybody under the age of 18 to play a pinball machine. In the state of Washington, it is illegal to harass Bigfoot. In Waterbury, Connecticut, it's illegal for any beautician to whistle, hum, or sing while working on a customer. Now, most of us would agree these are ridiculous laws, and they are. But they're also on the books. Now, they're not enforced, and nobody's going to come arrest you for harassing Bigfoot. But they're on the books, and when police officers have to pick and choose whether or not to enforce a law because the law just doesn't make sense, it harms the credibility of the entire legal system because sometimes it makes it feel like the laws are being arbitrarily enforced. Sometimes we undercriminalize behaviors. For instance, does anybody remember the Ford Pinto? Oh, it was an ugly looking little car in the 70s. But people ran out and bought it because it didn't take a whole lot of gas to run it. And this was a time when people were standing in long lines at gas stations because we had a national gas shortage. And so families trusted the Ford Corporation and ran out and bought these by the bunches. The only problem was if you hit these cars just right from the rear end, they'd blow up. Now, when this happened to a lot of families, they sued the Ford Corporation. And they said, look, we bought this product, we trusted you. Our family members are dead. Some of them are injured. Some of them may be crippled for life. One of the things that happens when a company gets sued is that documents that usually wouldn't see the light of day all of a sudden become evidence and are presented in court. And that's what happened in this case. It turns out the Ford Motor Company knew very well before they produced these vehicles that this was a problem and that this would cost lives. In court records, they had to present the actual cost-benefit analysis that they went through. And you can see it right here on your screen. The costs, there's about 11 million cars. And in order to fix the cars, it's about $11 per part. That equals up to $121 million. We figure we'll sell about 1.5 million trucks. They had the same problem as well. About $11 a part again. That's going to be about $16.5 million for a total of $137.5 million. Now the benefits or the risks that would be entailed by the Ford Motor Company would be, we're going to estimate that about 180 people are going to burn to death. And looking at court records, the going rate for a wrongful death suit of that kind is about $200,000 per person. That equals a total value of $36 million. About 180 people we figure will be seriously burned or have serious injuries. The going rate for that based on court records is about $67,000 apiece, equaling $12.1 million. And we'll have about 2,100 burned vehicles. And we'll figure about $700 per vehicle. That's about what seems to be the going rate in the court system, and that's $1.5 million. And so we'll have to pay out, after these people are killed, burned, mutilated, about $49.6 million. That's a whole lot less than if we pay the $137.5 million and fix the car. And so to save costs, the Ford Motor Company decided to go ahead and release the car as is, knowing full well that they had already done this cost-benefit analysis. Well, people in the community lost their minds, and they just couldn't believe that this is how a company would act. Not one person was ever charged with any crime. They just simply had to pay out the money, and according to this cost-benefit analysis, probably made quite a bit. Now, some people, I'm sure, had to resign with nice golden parachutes that provided them a great deal of wealth on the way out. Now let's take a deeper dive into the elements of a crime. 1. Actus reus. Remember, there has to be a criminal action. You can't arrest me and charge me and prosecute me for thinking about doing something. I have to actually engage in some type of behavior that moves forward the commission of the crime. Second thing is mens rea. Remember, we talked about different levels of culpability or different levels of intent. The first one we're going to talk about is purposefully. This is where I did it on purpose. I meant to do what I did. I thought about doing it. I planned it out. I put it into action. I committed the crime. I intended to do exactly what I did. The next level of culpability is knowingly. When I act knowingly, I may not intend on the harm that's going to result to happen, but I act in a way that a rational human being would understand that there's a high probability that the harm's going to occur. So, for instance, a few years ago, there were some kids dropping rocks off of a bridge onto a highway. Somebody died as a result of their actions. Now, these kids may not have intended to kill someone, but a rational human being would have understood that by doing that, you have a high probability that somebody's going to get seriously hurt or killed. When I act recklessly, I act in a way that disregards a substantial risk that any reasonable human being would recognize. And I engage in a behavior that I know could result in harm to another human being. The difference between recklessly and knowingly is that when I act knowingly, the end result, the harm that's going to be caused, is almost a certainty. Recklessly, there's just a substantial risk that a reasonable person should recognize that this particular behavior is going to result in the harm. Negligently means that you act in a way that causes a substantial risk of another person getting hurt or injured, even if you weren't aware at the time that such a substantial risk was present. We also measure crimes based on whether they're felonies or misdemeanors and what level of felony or misdemeanor. So at the top, you have celebrated cases. These are cases that make national attention, or at least attention within your community. These are unusual cases, maybe serial killers, extremely violent cases, things like that. Then you have your serious felonies. These are felonies that are going to get you a long time in an institution. Lesser felonies are at that year and above mark, but they're usually not for really long periods of time. Misdemeanors, again, are those crimes that you commit that are local crimes, smaller crimes, and punishable up to a year in jail. One of the big debates within the field of criminal justice is how should our criminal justice practitioners go about making our streets safer. Everyone within the criminal justice field wants to ultimately make our communities a safer place for people to live. There's two distinct categories of individuals on this debate stage. The first is due process. These individuals believe that a person's individual rights and their constitutional protections need to be protected at all times throughout the criminal justice process, and that the letter of the law needs to be followed to make sure that nobody's rights are trampled upon. By doing this, they argue, will make our streets safer. They recognize that by protecting individuals' rights and their constitutional protections, it's less likely that we're going to get the wrong person convicted for a criminal act in our community. This protects the individual that could have been wrongfully convicted because now they don't have to go to prison. They're not torn away from their families. They can continue to contribute to society. And also it protects the community in that the person who did commit the crime doesn't have someone else doing his time, so no police officers or criminal justice system isn't looking for him, and he's free to continue to victimize the community. Crime control advocates say, look, we live in a dangerous time. Police officers have a lot on their plate. Wrapping them up in all this bureaucratic red tape only prolongs the process of an investigation, allows offenders to continue to commit crimes in the community, and allows some offenders to fall within the loopholes of the system and not be prosecuted for the crimes that they've committed. This makes our communities less safe. Police don't need to operate with these handcuffs on them They need to operate in a way where we trust the police and we trust that they're going to keep our best interests at heart. And this way they can streamline the process of criminal conviction and get more offenders off the streets. Now, they recognize that sometimes you're going to get the wrong person, but they argue that that's a danger that you just have to accept, because we have to get these dangerous people off the street as quickly as possible to protect our community. Due process people say that's not the case. How you protect people is by protecting their rights and protecting their freedoms and making sure that you get the right person for the right crime.